have been doing, that I have been thinking about, publishing about, and maybe in the end also some hints about what I'm planning to do next. And of course, I will be very happy in the Q&A, in the discussion, to have as many thoughts from you as possible. Okay, and my work is, as I said, is a philosophical work. So I'm asking theoretical philosophical questions on the problem of obstetric violence. No. Yeah, okay, it's okay. Okay, I start by saying that all this investigation starts from my own experience on obstetric violence, my second birth. I was very impressed since my first birth about from this experience. I mean, I got very overwhelmed, and I didn't expect to have the experiences I had, the things the thoughts I had. And of course, I started even then to think how philosophically I could talk, and I could think and write about this subject. But the second birth left me with scars, which I couldn't spot on in the moment they happened. I mean, of course, it took time for me to understand, because this was not blatant violence. It was more kind of normalized practices that I will speak about more in the following. And so it was a feeling of, I'm healthy, my baby's healthy, but something here happened that shouldn't have happened. And it intrigued me, and I started reading about it, and then I discovered there is this concept of obstetric violence, and then I understood that there were so many philosophical questions that needed to be asked here that weren't asked. Also, because philosophy usually doesn't get interest in this subject, in these issues. Of course, also because there are women issues mainly, and also because, so minority issues, and also because they seem like issues that have to do with nature, and not with things that we can think about philosophically, etc. So I will go very quickly on obstetric violence, assuming that maybe not all of you have heard the concept or understand exactly what we're talking about, but I will try to go through this quickly, because I assume most of you have already heard at least what is this about. So yes, obstetric violence can be defined in broad terms as a dehumanized treatment of birthing women, physical and or emotional mistreatment, and above all, from my point of view, the transformation of women from body subjects to body objects, from slave to corporate. And I am using phenomenological concepts used in philosophy to speak about how we are subjects, embodied subjects, which means active and living subjects, and on the other hand, we can be objectified, either externally for external reasons, or either internally, and objectify ourselves too. So in obstetric violence, we are transformed from subjects into objects. Obstetric violence is an intersection between institutional violence against women during pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum. It's important to say this is a gender violence. This is something that I've done in my work. I will speak a little bit more later about this. This is not only medical violence, but this is also institutional structural violence, which means it doesn't have to do mainly, at least, with doctors or staff doing bad things to people because they are bad persons and they want bad things for the people that are being taken care of, but more like a system which promotes and gives place to these practices which are violent. some of the criteria that Born and others in their 2015 paper, they set up some criteria on what will be obstetric violence. So it's physical abuse, verbal abuse, stigma and discrimination, failure to meet professional standards of care, poor rapport between women and providers, health system conditions and constraints, which can be in poor or more marginal populations. They're usually too little, too late. They are called as women giving birth receive too little care, too little interventions, too late in childbirth. And on the other hand, wealthy populations usually get too much intervention too soon, labor. This is also part of obstetric violence. And I will speak more, I think, about the second one, which is the one I am more interested in, also because it was my own experience, and also because I think philosophically it has some more interesting aspects. Obstetric violence is also a factor for trauma. We know that also from some of the research. I mean, women go out from birth having PTSD, partial or total. We know the discussion on obstetric violence started in Latin America. Important to know it, like even 20 or even more years ago. It's interesting why it started there. And speak about it more later. But there is a law. The first law on obstetric violence was the Venezuelan law. Afterwards, Mexico, Argentina, other places also adopted this law. And this is how obstetric violence is defined by the law. We see here also loss of autonomy, dehumanization, normal processes turning into pathological processes unnecessarily, and affecting the quality of life of women. And all these terms already define this violence, I think, as gender violence and probably also as sexual violence, because there is an impact also on the sexuality of women. The research on obstetric violence, it keeps growing and growing. I mean, we all the researchers here from obstetric violence, we remember that was a decade ago, even a little bit more, there was very little research. And on the last years, it has been really, really growing. The phenomenon has been recognized already by the UN and by the World Health Organization as a problem that has to be tackled and prevented all over the world. So I usually bring this slide that I brought now also to convince the people that are that are thinking that this is maybe like a crazy feminist stuff. So I try to bring that. So it's medical violence in the sense that also, for example, Drew Leder, this philosopher of body and of pathology, he tells us that bodies in medicine are objectified, are transformed into passive, immobile, and docile objects. We know that, I mean, this is not only happening in childbirth, right? This is happening also in other, or in medicalized settings in general. Emily Martin, even in 1987, she already wrote on women's birthing bodies like they are objectified, they are turned into baby containers. But we want to say more. We want to say this is also a gender violence, and how exactly and why, and how can we think about this or say something about this philosophically? Okay, so I want to say something about the medicalized birth. Yes, this is promotional material from an Israeli series called television series called Baby Boom, which is a series filming births in hospitals. And it's a very popular series. And of course, usually the births seen there in the end are good births, no? Although all women are birthing in beds, and yeah, we have all the normalized violence, but nobody notices this. And this is a promotional material. This doctor is a real doctor. I have been in a panel with him. It was terrible. And and this is a photo, and I mean we can see here. I mean, I think this is not done. This hasn't been done with humor. It's a real promotional material for the series, and I think we can see what's wrong there, right? I mean, and we see the doctor, we see the halo, and the baby, and we see the husband, and we see the nurses, and that's it. And we see legs. Okay, so speaking about the humanization of women in childbirth, and it's not only in Israel apparently, and this is also a photo of One Born Every Minute, which is a British series too. And we have almost the same images here. Okay, so what I argue is that there is something more here than the typical medical reification, from medical from medicalized settings, because I argue that the birthing body is, of course, we know it's not a pathological body. Yes, it doesn't go to the hospital because of a pathology, and it's also active and also erotic, and it's prototype of what we call in phenomenology, in feminist phenomenology and phenomenology in general, it's typical of the I-can body. Yes, it's a body which is powerful, which can do things, and it's tamed and silenced when obstetric violence is used. This body is also vulnerable, and thus it's easily controlled and exploited. This is more or less why I argued in my first article on obstetric violence, Making Loud Bodies Feminine, a feminist phenomenological analysis of obstetric violence. I used Iris Marion Young, Throwing Like a Girl, to speak about how this active body, this body that can be extended, that is in birth, it's a very loud, expansive, kind of grotesque body, and this is not a feminine body. It doesn't cover the feminine standards of female bodies, so it has to be put in place. No? So this is a quote from the article. Laboring bodies.
Sorry, you have to.
Yeah, I can.
I don't want to interrupt you.
Sorry.
I'm not to interrupt you.
Yes, I'm sorry. Laboring bodies then are violently turned into objects, not only because this is comfortable for the medical staff, but mainly because they are feminine bodies threatening their own passive femininity. Bodies acting from immanence, reaching toward transcendence, living vigorous sexual bodies challenging patriarchy. Their sexuality thus appears to be not a commodified sexuality, but one that owns itself, a sexuality in charge of itself, so to speak, and not existing purely as subject for the other. This is a body then that has to be put in its place, to be reminded again and again about its inherent passivity. This is part of my argument. In another article afterwards that I wrote with my PhD students, Keshet Korem, we spoke about shame, about the role of shame in obstetric violence. I think maybe I didn't say that very clearly before, but we are speaking about very normalized practices, which are which are violent because they are restricting, because they are taking agency from us, because we feel abandoned through them. And shame is one of the ways to perpetrate this violence in a very comfortable way for the staff. Because when you are ashamed of taking decisions, of being of taking property of your body, it's much easier to do this violence to you. No? So we argue that there is shame in at least two ways in obstetric violence. The first one is the shame for not being a good mother or a good mother to be. Yeah, it's not you are not a self-sacrificing mother as you should be. Yes, so many women getting into the birthing room, when they try to have things for themselves, decide decisions for themselves. And of course, here, the division between yourself and your baby, it's also like a very artificial division that the medical staff is also very many times interested in doing for their own purposes. when you take things for yourself, you are being a selfish mother. You're being not a good self-sacrificing mother, and then you're being ashamed. You're being blamed, and who wants that? No, yes, the ideal mother. Okay, the ideal mother, as well as the ideal potentially pregnant and birthing women, is an unselfish woman who has abandoned or is willing to abandon selfish, childish behavior for a higher form of femininity. This discourse is central to the ideal of motherhood and femininity, and also affects women's perceptions of their optimal choices in childbirth, often pushing them toward a willingness to experience pain and suffering and undergo any experience identified with maternal sacrifice, etc. This is internalized by women, and this allows obstetric violence. So this is one of the ways. The other one is our bodies as dirty, as incapable, as you don't know how to push, you don't know what to do, you need to follow my instructions. And this body, which makes itself to feel that it is a shameful body, a dirty body, a body which is not capable, it's also a very good way to make women accept, to agree to these medical interventions without them feeling that they are doing something wrong, they are doing something right, they are doing something to have their body more clean, more sterile, more beautiful, sexually available, etc. Yes. So you read this quote, I won't read it. So why aren't we speaking? Yes. Why aren't we speaking? Because you should be thankful. The baby is all right. Yes. This is usually the way these discussions are cut, are censored. Pain and suffering are perceived as integral to childbirth. Violent experiences of laboring women go unrecognized by both the women's immediate community and the medical staff. Women are silenced. All that matters is that the baby is healthy. And yes, I mean, this is a photo, this is a classic of, I think, of obstetric violence. And yes, at least you have a healthy baby, and what happens in between, nobody cares. Afterwards, I started discussing epistemic questions. I was very interested to understand why we are not seeing this violence, why we are not recognizing this violence as violence. Not women, of course, not the staff. No, why it's so difficult to see obstetric violence when it's not blatant violence? Yes, when it's not shouting or hitting you or things like that, that maybe sometimes even those things are recognized as normal, depending the context. But these are easier things to recognize as violence, but not the more subtle violence. So I published until now two articles on epistemic injustice and obstetric violence. One is a chapter in a book edited also by Camila Herring. It's called Amiga Sisters, We Are Being Gaslight, Obstetric Violence and Epistemic Injustice. It's about gaslighting. And the other one is it's a more recent article on testimonial injustice. I will speak about it more later, but first of all, the gaslighting thing. So women are gaslighted in the labor room. Not only in the labor room, we know that in medicine in general, women are less epistemic subjects in general in society. They are less believed, they have credibility deficit. And we have this example from Jordan. It's an old example, but I think it's very relevant even today. Yes, she knows she has to push, and she says so clearly. She also expresses it in the visible, almost superhuman effort she marshals to suppress the urge to push. But every time she tries to get her desire, her expressed knowledge about the state of her body acknowledged and made the basis for proceeding with the birth, her version of reality is overridden, is ignored, is denied, or most frequently is sidetracked, deflected, and replaced with some other definition of reality. something else is offered up as being more relevant, as might happen to an obstinate child whose parent opts for destruction rather than confrontation. And this is what many women experience during childbirth. No, we know this from many women. The gaslighting of birthing women is possible since it inserts itself into a general context in which women are in principle already flawed epistemic agents or not considered epistemic agents at all. Before I go to the problem of consent, I just want to say that when I wrote my paper on gaslighting, based also in an experience that I had, not in the labor room this time, but an experience I had with one of many miscarriages I had after my 2 births, and in which ghost of obstetric violence. When I went, because I was bleeding, I was almost in the 7th week, I was bleeding, and I had an experience already of having many miscarriages, more or less in those times. And I went to the ER and I met a very nice young female doctor who told me, okay, I'm going to check you. She checked me, she said, okay, you have an embryo 4 weeks old. Everything seems to be okay. You're bleeding like many women at this stage. Everything is fine, go home. And I told her, yes, but I think it's a fetus that had stopped developing, and this is a miscarriage because I am 7 weeks pregnant. I'm not 4 weeks pregnant. And then she said, well, but you don't know when you got pregnant, really. I'm like, no, yes, I know. And how did you know? No, I feel ovulation. I had even tests, everything. So, well, we cannot base a diagnosis in your intuitions. Okay. And of course, I got very mad, and I went home, and I was like, I thought back then she could have told me something like, you know what, maybe your explanation is plausible. Maybe what I'm saying is the truth. Let's see what happens, because I was not offering like a very non-medical explanation. I was not telling her, I know that I'm 7 weeks pregnant because an angel came and told me, or I am 20 weeks pregnant, don't you see? It was not that. It was something that could be true. It was true in the end. But she totally discredited my knowledge of embodied knowledge. And it was so clear to me that this embodied knowledge, if it's not seen in the ultrasound, is intuition. It's not real knowledge. So in my second article on testimonial injustice, I speak also about this, about knowledge of the physiological kind of the knowledge that we have, for example, in birth and also in some other reproductive processes, is not considered knowledge many times by the medical staff, because sometimes they cannot measure it, they don't know exactly how to relate to it. And also because we are women, and we are women, and also in birth, we are of course hysterical, we don't know what we want, etc., etc. So this even makes us less credible. The next question that I wrote about many different ways was the problem of consent, because I think lately what we know, maybe also from the legal point of view, I think it's very easy to frame these questions and this problem of obstetric violence as a problem of consent. We just need to make sure that women consent to practices, and then we are safe. We are safe, and everything is okay. And what I say is that no, of course, consent is just a very superficial level of what's happening. And many women consent to things because of many reasons that I've been also epistemically trying to sort out here. So, for example, in my paper on vaginal examinations, why normal feels so bad. Yes, it's many practices are practices that are normalized, that we don't even have the language to speak about them as violent. We will say yes because we have no other even possibilities in our head. And in the vaginal examinations paper, I speak specifically about this being sexually available and being sexual objects, which we are in, women are in patriarchy. And this is why informed consent is not enough. If we women are used to constitute sexual objects to please others and to experience pain and violence. So yes, performing us 10 vaginal examinations in 3 hours, or I don't know what, it's like, okay, I'm there, I'm legs opened, everything is available, and maybe it's not different from how I feel in general that I should be in these patriarchal concepts, no? We lack concepts even to allowing to understand these events as violence. So this is a case also of hermeneutical injustice in Fricker's concepts. So if you compare with sexual violence, I think there are a lot of similarities, also some differences. But if we compare it to sexual violence, so for example, Diana Taylor writes, with respect to sexual violence against women, the normative distinction at stake is not so much whether sexual violence is morally acceptable or reprehensible, but rather whether sexual violence is or is not properly violence at all. If simply being embodied as a woman is to ask for it, then any degree of male sexual attention directed at women cannot by definition be unwanted and hence a violation. This in turn calls into question whether such attention can be the sort of forcible and injurious action that constitutes violence. I think this is very productive for thinking also about obstetric violence. I won't read this Butler's frame of war quote, but I think it's important to see how she, for example, speaks about how sometimes we don't have concepts or words to speak about certain things that we are feeling, but we have this apprehension, which I interpret as a body apprehension that sometimes we have, even not knowing that's why something is wrong. We feel that something is wrong, for example. And I bring here an example from a doula testimony. Which is an interesting example of a bystander feeling things are not right and feeling it has been violence here. But she said, I had a response in my body from what I was seeing. I knew my body was responding to something, even I was not the person that it was happening to. This tells us something also important, and I wrote about it too, about the importance of relationships in childbirth. The importance of not seeing obstetric violence only as something that has to do with agency and with the loss of agency and autonomy, but the loss of a relation, of a caring relation that we are expecting in childbirth. Many women speak about this as abandonment, as we didn't feel seen, we didn't feel recognized. And I think here we have a positive example of this doula, experiencing what was going wrong. I have like 2 minutes.
It's 4 minutes.
Okay. The other question is how, again, a little bit like Me Too, the subtle violence is difficult to recognize. I said that before. Yes, it's like we know what's rape, but many of maybe we know better what's rape, but things that we have been discussing in Me Too, like the softest, more subtle kinds of violence, they are more difficult to recognize, more difficult to speak of. And also here we have the problem of this beneficial place, the hospital. How can we think about violence coming from these medical staff who wants the best for us, et cetera, et cetera? It's very difficult for us to see violence here. And it's also very difficult for the medical staff. They get very offended to be, when we have so many discussions about using the term violence, and we have seen that, and there's also in the research, why violence? How can you say that we are violent? And I think that's why also it's very important to emphasize when we speak to them, the structural dimension of this violence. Okay, maybe another problem of consent, which is interesting philosophically. It's more abstract, I think, to think about, but consent presumes a level of self-knowledge that individuals often lack. Many of us are often ignorant of our own desires, so suggesting that we can know what we want the moment we are asked overlooks historically coded forms of behavior, the effects of past experiences, and the relative power of differing social locations. So our subjectivity is less firm than we would want to. So when we say yes to something, maybe it's in that moment, but things change also in the process, and we have to take this also into account. I will have to finish and to skip much of this. This is more of my new work that I also presented in the last days. If we can be complicit of obstetric violence, some of us, some women, if we are only victims, or if we can think about ourselves also as complicit in some way, as objectifying ourselves. This is an interesting question, I think. And well, the disability theories I will skip. This is something also I want to do. I want to speak about the body as grotesque body, a little bit similar in some ways to disabled bodies, and to say that maybe if we adopt some of the rhetoric of disability studies, maybe the medical staff through this can relate to the birthing body in a different way. But this is also work in progress. I will just finish with this issue. And what about the medical staff? Yes. Medical practitioners, obstetricians and gynecologists, midwives and medical residents are themselves treated violently by violent systems and structures, which in turn make them act in violent ways towards patients. For example, a very young woman, a resident in obstetrics, and this is a true story, told me a story about being socially compelled to perform a vaginal examination on an anesthetized woman because all of her superiors were watching her and expecting her to do it. So I do not mean to say here in any way that the perpetrators of violence suffer from that violence in the same manner as do the victims of the violence, in this case, birthing women. But I do truly believe that just as patriarchy cannot be combated without also looking at the price that men pay for living in patriarchal systems, nor can obstetric violence be tackled without reflecting on the ways in which the perpetrators of this violence are themselves the victims of violent structures and trauma. And this is the end for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Camilla, for having me here, and Sara and Rachelle. It is such a joy for me and delight to be able to present with these two scholars who, of course, have been idols of mine. And yeah, today I am going to use passion, pleasure, and power to rethink and reposition some of the issues of obstetric violence. I'm going to do this by using ethnography as a methodology to unpack and examine the different dimensions of birthing experiences. And these ideas have also been sort of developing over time for me, and there are various different threads that I'm going to be drawing on. And so, yeah, please feel free also to ask any questions at the end, and for clarification, I'd love to get your feedback. So I think importantly, I want to lay out that I use my story because it is mine, and not to substitute as an answer for the problematic of obstetric violence. But I link it to a problem of the epistemic dimension and racialized dimension of obstetric violence, which relates to the erasure of indigenous knowledges, Black indigenous midwifery, and also how that has been written into the archives. And what happens when we find living stories of these living embodiments and occurrences that challenge that idea. And my story is part of that. Then I offer a snippet from my PhD research and use this concept of creolization as a way to also think through ambiguity that I think, Sara, you also use as a concept in your theorizing of obstetric violence. And I do so in relation to my observations of the antenatal ultrasound, and think more broadly about the ambiguous relation of the two-in-one body and the seen and unseen worlds. So many of us are drawn to this work through our own experiences, as you will just have heard, or through the experiences that others share with us. We know the responsibility that comes with telling our stories and in using these stories to do activist work, to champion and question and push back and to reimagine new futures. Recently, as I've been reflecting on the significance of my own birth experience that is occurring as my daughter turns 18, I've been pondering on where it is that I am positioned in debates about and discourses on obstetric violence through my own story. I return to birth stories really in the context of having recently completed my PhD. I mean, it was in 2021. I'm not sure for how long I can still keep calling it recent, but it feels recent. And when I was told by one of my examiners, it would be useful and interesting to know early on in this thesis, what connections or personal interests drove this candidate to research this topic? Has she been a pregnant patient, a healthcare worker in obstetrics? Was she able to speak their language in terms of shared experiences? Any other positionality that led her to pursue this topic and perhaps have prior knowledge of the issues before speaking to participants? Basically, what drove her to research risk in pregnancy and childbirth? So in this presentation, I use autoethnography as a methodology to think about birth as an experience and an expression of love. In so doing, I take my lead from Rodante van der Waal, Kaveri Myra, Anna Hall, and Rachelle Chadwick's work on refracting obstetric violence through abolition feminism. Specifically, I argue alongside them that birth needs to be extracted from the frames imposed by the obstetric institution. These frames function as a deficit model of childbirth, wherein birth is understood to be inherently risky and needing medical intervention and surveillance, and of life as non-death. And so, despite birth being a normal physiological process, these deficit models of birth give rise to ideas about birth as needing to take place in the hospital, and their location there as being a sensible and logical space for birth to happen, where sickness and death can be managed and treated and averted. So in attempting to reclaim birth from this paradigm, I'm hoping to use this space to think about what can be gained from placing ideas about passionate, pleasurable, powerful birth at the center of debates and concerns to do with obstetric violence. What implications are there for theorizing these paradoxes of childbirth that seemingly juxtapose contradictory notions like risk and safety, death and birth, violence and vulnerability, pain and pleasure? So I invite you now to come and sit around the metaphoric fireside to journey into this talk of different dimensions of birth as a vehicle to interrogate this. Breathe. Help me as the next generation carves a pathway from my body. Breathe. In the space between worlds, I link my life and yours. Breathe. Each physical exertion pushes you towards my arm. Breathe in vigor and action. This poem and imagery was part of the collage and birth imaginary that I created when I was pregnant and had at the fireside altar of my birth. And they tie and link to my experience as an exile in New Zealand through Maori poetry and this image of a Hine Te Iwaiwa, who's known as the spiritual guardian of childbirth, who's connected to the cycles of the moon and assists at the time of entrance and exit into this world. Somehow these words and this image, totally unconnected actually, but in fact evoked for me the power and the presence of childbirth. And they also connected me distinctly through my genealogy to embodied practices of midwifery. I come from a long line of midwives, and I grew up hearing stories of my grandmother pedaling her bicycle to home births in the coloured area of Hunklip that overlooks the ocean in Hout Bay. My namesake and great-grandmother, Oma, was the midwife in attendance when my grandmother was born. When her mother died of complications days after the birth, my Oma went to fetch my grandma and brought her up to become her own daughter. This question, where have all the midwives gone, was a question that I hoped to be able to answer and to be able to tell in my postgraduate studies. But of course, while I had heard whispers and knew anecdotally of this evidence of Indigenous Black midwifery practices, I couldn't find them written up anywhere. Well, thankfully, Tamia Boates's work points out that I didn't look hard enough. Tamia Boates's historiography traces the footfro, the Black autonomous midwife who embodies Indigenous birthing knowledge systems in South Africa, who supposedly disappeared from the archive from 1865 onwards. But in the ways of living Indigenous systems, she finds them living and breathing and central to practices of care at the heart of the coloured township of Eldorado Park in Johannesburg. And it is this very racialized history of midwifery that is part and parcel of their disappearance from or invisibility within the archives. And so while Tamia discusses the healing practices of the footfro, which include home hospitals, infertility treatments, healing medicinal herbs, food gardens, and placental rituals, her work is in fact that kind of restorative healing practice that denies the colonial and racialized erasure of the epistemic injustice of obstetric violence. That, of course, has ripped the cultural and social fabric of marginalized and Black communities and their knowledges of birth. So the footthrow exist on the margins of power, and yet they are central to the networks of community and of care that sustain spaces of commonality, of love, and of community. So she discusses the practices of the foot frow in relation to an idea of creolization developed by Dimitri Erasmus. Dimitri Erasmus theorizes colored identities, and in her book Race Otherwise, Forging a Humanism for South Africa, posits that creolization is a resource for coming to know and make subjectivities in ways that challenge the normative practices of race classification and the normative ideals presented by a politics of cultivating purity. She emphasizes that creolization is a process produced from people's movements and their interactions through interconnected histories and processes of absorption, displacement, domination, cultural borrowing, disillusion, and marked by changing power relations and historical conditions. Creolization thus enables multiple belongings and makes identifications fluid and always produced in relation to others. It thus makes possible new ways of seeing the self and others. So creolization, I'm positing here, is a starting point for challenging normative processes and applying this to birth. I believe creolization offers ways for us to break down hierarchies of birth, whether between different modes of birth, between birth givers and medicine workers, between medicine and sociality, and that the breakdown of these hierarchies and binaries is important and is made space for within this notion of creolization. And that this is necessary work in relation to birth, not only because birth remains captured in these dichotomous frameworks and epistemologies, that create unreasonable and unfounded comparisons. And that really came up sharply for me in relation to my PhD, where some of the private obstetricians whose practices I was observing became the very pregnant participants that I went to them in the first place to be able to trace their pregnancy journeys with obstetricians. And so these multiple positions that were both and became very present in the research. And so I wanted to offer you a snippet from my PhD, which extends this theme of ambiguity and contradiction. Ambiguity really as contained by and made space for in this notion of creolization. So in my PhD, I looked at obstetric risk from the perspective of the private obstetrician, the pregnant patient, and the unborn. To do so, I did about 2.5 years of field work, which felt like it was committing academic suicide, because I traced pregnancies from about the 8-week confirmation of pregnancy mark to about 6 weeks postpartum, and journeyed with those pregnant patients with their private obstetricians in the private sector. Through 7 obstetric practices, I had 14 pregnant women located in 6 private and 1 public hospital. But in fact, they gave birth in more like 10 hospitals because one of the unfounded assumptions that quickly became shown to me were untrue was that this pathway was divergent, that it didn't start off and continue in the same way. Women made choices early on about where to give birth, which obstetrician, depending on the different prices. There's a multitude of prices in the private sector, different from hospital to hospital, from practitioner to practitioner. did the hospital have to be close to where they worked or close to their homes? You know, who did they resonate with? And also, what did their medical aid entitle them to? And what this meant was that there were 2 participants in the study who, in fact, the one lost her medical aid because she had swapped her medical aid just at the time when her pregnancy was unidentified, and so became a freestanding condition for which the new insurance would not pay. The other participant, from the beginning, went and sought out private sector care, researching online for an obstetrician offering high care, because she had had a previous stillborn at the very public hospital that she would have to return to give birth a second time, and where at the time of her stillborn, the obstetrician on rotation said to her, if your child had been born in the private sector, it would not have died. So she sought private sector care that she paid for out of pocket herself. Ironically, with an obstetrician who just 6 months earlier had worked in that very same hospital, for whom there was no permanent jobs and had to start up a brand new practice in private. So I went to about 55 antenatal consultations. I sat in about 15 specialist scans, attended community birth meetings, baby showers, birth preparation courses, and kept quite an extensive research journal and observational notes. And in this multi-site ethnography, I asked the participants to generate for me something of a birth map. And I inquired into it in the following way. I said, if you could please think back to a point in time when you feel like this pregnancy began. It doesn't have to be when you conceived or when you found out you were pregnant, but any point in time that you associate somehow with the beginning of this process. And I'd like you to represent it graphically from then until now. You can imagine most participants needed a moment just to be able to think of how to do this for me. But I asked it in this way because in the pilot phase of my PhD, I spoke to a number of couples who'd had fertility problems, and it sort of revealed to me that their preconception journeys were ripe with these almost beginnings that alerted me to pregnancy potentialities. And when I asked this question in this way, I got answers that were like the glint in the milkman's eyes, right? They were a moment of knowing that passed between lovers, an instinctual, serendipitous aha. One of the participants, who I called Louise, drew a church with a path leading into it and a path leading out the other side. Through this symbol, she plotted not only the beginning of a life, but the end of one. Not just a pregnancy journey, but a life journey. She plots the beginnings of her unborn's life in a church, in a moment shared between her and her partner that is surreptitiously captured on camera, marking its significance. And she gives me a copy of the photograph to go with it. As a conception story, knowledge is transferred through this look between the two lovers and is a sign. Louise's photograph with her future fiance captures this fleeting moment. And so it is interesting that Louise not only comes up with a fetal beginning, but takes that full circle when she connects this into an imagined ending of a life that would also take place in a church during a funeral. And so in my thesis, while I didn't use this concept of creolization, I used the concept of hybridization ambiguity, to think through some of these slippery notions. And it was, in fact, rooted and triggered by the obstetricians, 3 of whom told me that in their view, obstetrics was like art. Obstetrics as art, as defined to me by the obstetricians. Is it okay?
Everything's fine.
Okay, good, thank you. So what really stood out for me about this description that these obstetricians gave about their work as art was that there is a hybridity, not only in the actual technology of the ultrasound, that in the literature is quite clear that this is a hybrid technology, right, that brings together medicine and science. But of course, birth in itself, also a social process, and inescapably medical also, right? I use this kind of fruitful potentiality there in medicine and birth to do this sort of creative work of thinking of through these potentialities, these almost theirs, these nearly buts, and these unseen essences as this beautiful image of images here. Ambiguity as abstract otherness displaces medical knowledge and locates birth givers with wombs squarely in the position of entitled knowledge holder of the unborn. Now, how did I get to this idea? I sat in on these obstetric ultrasounds, and in much of the literature, which is very much dominated by writings from the global north, women are seen to be disembodied through this process, right? They're cut off, they're just seen as bellies, and their inner experience has to be outwardly imaged for them to have an authentic experience of this. But in fact, when I looked at the literature in Africa on African cultural practices and indigenous knowledge systems and cosmologies, what I, of course, found was that much has been written about the ways the unseen or the ancestors interact in living color with the lived world. They intercede in people's dreams, they intercede to change people's futures. They are in fact honored in traditions and in rituals. And so this more continuous notion of the unseen as merged with and interacting with the lived world gave a way of speaking about and understanding birth givers with wombs as this container of and originator of knowledge of the unborn. And so while this technology, the ultrasound, and the work of the obstetrician, as they said to me, they said, you know, we can examine that ultrasound in 5 minutes, but we sit here for half an hour. Because it's a social process, because they want to invite their husbands and their children, and, you know, we have to do all of this other social work. So they themselves did the work, the medical work and the social work together. And of course, I found pregnant participants doing the social work, but also medical work themselves, going and getting themselves tested, you know, taking their blood pressure, and these regimes of medicines and vitamins. So this idea of hybridity that was so clearly evident in the ultrasound encounter, I used to consider more broadly these reproductive histories, politics, and biologies in ways that break down binaries between science and sociality, and that were largely inspired by a global South African-centered approach that accounted for ambiguity, fluidity, affinity, and creolization. In returning to a snippet of the birth story, it is dark, and I've been pacing all day, round and round through the garden and the house. Finally, my mucus plug breaking, giving me actual evidence of what was transpiring in my body, and I phoned my midwife to please come. And when she came, she placed me in the bath, and the warm waters could relieve the pain and tension in my muscles. And I'm sitting in the bath with my doula and my midwife and my husband around me. And there is this intense depth of feeling held by them and at the center of their attention. But I have been told that we are to wait, because although I have contractions to push and I am frustrated at having to wait, my body's own indication of readiness has not yet occurred. We are waiting for my waters to burst. And as I wearily turn to take Peter's hands and kiss him, out came the amniotic sac, fluidly, gently releasing into the water surrounding me and signaling to my unborn that it is time. So I wanted to share with you my story of giving birth here, to draw out the threads of connectedness and relatedness between my own life and that which has sustained a passion for me and belief in the life-giving and life-sustaining properties of giving birth. Not only through, of course, the adored child still living with me, but also through genealogies of Indigenous birthing, knowledges that I'm connected to that are still present in my story and present here in the shadows. And that work of reclaiming that which is in the shadows, bringing it to light, is part of our work as activists of obstetric violence. And that part of that work is to reposition at the center this joy and exuberance and love that is central to childbirth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. First of all, before I begin, I just want to say An absolute delight it is to be in Durham, and how wonderful it is to be part of this panel with Sara and Nicole. Sara, whose work I've been reading for many years and finding sort of nourishment and inspiration in your work. So I kind of feel like I know you already. And it's been wonderful to get to know you more. And also Nicole, who I've known for many, many years. So it's lovely also, Nicole, to reconnect with you. And then I want to say a special thank you to Camilla for really enabling this event to take place, for bringing us together. And thank you so much for your generosity and hospitality. It's really been a special, really special experience. Okay, so in this talk, which is titled Invisible Cages, Obstetric Oppression and the Question of Violence, I'm going to be talking about what I am terming obstetric oppression and how it relates to birthing violence. So I want to kind of just note at the outset of the talk, I'm going to try and look occasionally at the people on Zoom as well, but I want to note at the outset of the talk that this is a preliminary set of ideas. So it's not based on anything that has been published or anything that's written up in a polished sense. So I'm very much, in a sense, thinking out loud here. So you'll have to bear with me. There's some questions that I don't necessarily even know at the moment how I feel about how we should sort of respond to them or what the answers are. So I look forward to hearing people's views. So what I'm going to be doing, as I said, is kind of thinking out loud with the concept of oppression and sort of trying to think about how it might offer us some kind of means to deepen or enrich our understanding of the concept of obstetric violence. Some people might find this kind of exploration of terms to be quite boring or kind of bland, but bear with me because I think it is important that we do this kind of work, particularly that we ask what work we are expecting certain concepts to be doing for us. And I also do think that these are not just theoretical or abstract or rhetorical matters, but they really, really are important. And as we know, the politics of language and the kind of creation of new lexicons has been integral to feminist resistance work really from the beginning. And these kinds of questions about concepts are not just something that we do in the ivory tower, but they really have real impacts on the kinds of strategies that we come up with, feminist imagination around these issues, and also practical strategies on the ground. So this effort really to reflect on the relationship between the concepts of oppression and violence and what it means for feminist birth politics has its roots in a discomforting encounter with a text. And the text that I'm talking about, some of you might be familiar with, is the critique of the term obstetric violence that was written and published, or was published in 2021 in the journal Violence Against Women by Lapperman and Swartz. So they critique basically the language of obstetric violence, and they ask questions about this language. And in particular, they also sort of posing questions about some of my own specific usages of the term, particularly my usage of the term gentle violence. And what I'm going to be trying to do here is to, although I have already written a commentary in response to this, I've continued to think about the issues. And what I'm trying to do here in this paper today is to be open to this kind of discomforting critique and to really sit with the discomfort and say, although I do disagree with a lot of what is written in that text, is there something more here going on? Is there something worth exploring? Is there something worth, again, sitting in that uncomfortable chair and thinking more? Because as I've written in other work, discomfort can be a generative epistemic resource for us. It can be, I don't think it necessarily is, and I think it can be traumatizing, and it can also be something that can be damaging. I think it depends very much on where you're situated in the relations of power and privilege, but it can be a point where we can think again and we can think differently. So I think we do need to remain open and we need to remain teachable to these kinds of discomforting kinds of encounters. So the commentary paper by Lapperman and Swartz, published in 2021, was titled, "How Gentle Must Violence Against Women Be in Order Not to Be Violent?" It directly questioned the merit of the vocabulary of obstetric violence and argued that the lexicon itself could be doing violence to healthcare workers, and that the lexicon was also kind of implicated in kind of putting all women into a category of passive victimhood. So I must say, I passed through an array of different, emotional and intellectual responses when I read the text. At first, I was just irritated, and being honest, I was annoyed. I was a little bit angry. I felt also a bit perplexed by some of the conclusions that were reached in the article. So I went through the whole gamut of responses. I also thought there was quite a lot that was muddled. The conclusions that were reached were muddled in the piece. And that, I think, I wasn't sure whether that was the intention of the authors or whether it pointed to something much more significant, that is to a conceptual landscape that is not clear, and a conceptual landscape that is, borrowing from the very brilliant talk that Camilla Pickles did last year, a conceptual landscape or a concept in crisis. So is that piece actually pointing to that as well? So while uncertain about the motives and the intention of the authors, I do think that commentary is potentially dangerous and damaging. I'm not sort of confused about that. It does have the potential to undo a lot of the very important work that feminist activists have done to get this concept recognized. But by effectively sort of playing on that term gentle violence, which is interesting in how that is in the title of the piece, by mocking that term in a sense, the whole vocabulary of obstetric violence more broadly is being questioned and sort of really doubt is being cast on the entire vocabulary. So I wrote my commentary piece, and that's out there, but that wasn't the end of my thinking about this Lapperman and Swartz piece. It's continued to buzz away at the back of my head. And as I said, I'm trying to, instead of dismissing it wholesale, I'm trying to remain more open, because I think these kinds of critiques can be important for us. And in a sense, I've come to see critique also as a bit of an invitation, not just something to get sort of annoyed about or irritated with or be angry about, but an invitation to think again, to think further, and potentially to think with some more precision. I don't think that's a bad thing. But I also just want to say up front, I don't want to leave it sort of in any doubt that I'm absolutely committed to the lexicon of obstetric violence. That is absolutely not changed. But I think that we do need to ask specifically the question of what work are we expecting certain concepts to be doing for us? And is the concept of violence, is it expected to do too much work? Okay. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what Lapperman and Swartz wrote, because no doubt many of you are familiar with it. And I also just want to separate out the individual writers from the arguments, because I think I don't want to point to individuals as and to critique individuals, because I think the arguments that are in the piece, in a sense, are more widespread, and they point to a broader politics of doubt that really surrounds gender violence more broadly. So I don't necessarily think it was the intent of the authors to do damage or to disbelieve. And I'm not really interested in the intentions of the authors, actually. I'm interested more in what the arguments that they mobilize do. And I'm interested more in how we, us as feminists, us working in the sphere of obstetric violence, how we can respond in ways that counter these kinds of mystifications and how we can clarify the field in a sense. So Moira Lapperman, just to give you a bit of background, is a clinical psychologist.
I'm so sorry, the slides aren't moving online.
Okay. Yeah. So I think I was on this slide. So I was giving you a little bit more background about this critique that was written by Lapperman and Swartz. So Moira Lapperman is a clinical psychologist in South Africa who did work in the public healthcare sector on stillbirth and was using this whole framework of obstetric violence. But then in and through the work that she was doing and in through thinking about what she kind of noticed as silence on the labor wards, she came to question this whole vocabulary of obstetric violence. And that's what then led to the article that was co-authored with Leslie Swartz. So in the commentary, the two authors are really arguing for a more restricted definition of violence that reserves the use of the term violence to describe and name direct and intentional violence between a clear perpetrator and a victim. But then they go further than that, funny enough. So it sort of slides from that to say, okay, we must just use this concept of violence to talk about, you know, what we all agree is direct violence. But then they slide towards actually going to a much more broader kind of argument where they actually say that the whole conceptual framework of obstetric violence is problematic. It's inflammatory, it's antagonistic, and it's not going to help us to really change or to improve maternity services. So they do this kind of movement and you're not quite sure how the steps are made. So they ultimately really are saying that we need to just sort of do away or not use this vocabulary of obstetric violence, and instead we should use a more benevolent term like mistreatment, which some, you know, do use in the literature. So just to be clear, I completely disagree with all of that that I've just outlined, the whole summary of that. I reject all of that. But I think as I've reflected more and more on the commentary, what is most disturbing and unsettling to me remains the way in which the piece launches its attack on obstetric violence through mocking that particular concept of gentle violence. So I've kept on trying to think some more about what is it about that term, gentle violence, that is opening a door for this kind of undermining of the whole vocabulary itself. So I hope the slides are moving. Yeah, great. Thanks, Nicole. So this term, gentle violence, is not my term, just to be very clear. This is a term that was coined by Pierre Bourdieu to describe the symbolic violence of gender domination. And symbolic violence is, according to Bourdieu, and I quote, the violence which is exercised upon a social agent with his or her complicity. So like structural and slow violence, this kind of idea of symbolic violence doesn't fit into the more conventional and narrow definitions or common sense understandings that many of us would have, where we, you know, what we think violence is. It involves a direct event, some act of force perpetrated on an individual body. And involving at least one perpetrator and victim. So this concept of symbolic violence is part of a more expansive vocabulary of violence, which is really interested in thinking more about that normalized violence, Sara, that you were talking about, that more invisible, socially sanctioned form of violence. So Bourdieu, I don't necessarily understand all this, and I'm still working through the literature. But as I understand it, for Bourdieu, the complicity that he describes does not mean that subjects choose to voluntarily submit violence. That's not the kind of complicity that he's talking about. So for him, this isn't a conscious complicity at all. It's instead a complicity that's woven into a kind of embodied habitus. This isn't a conscious thing. This is part of how we are, you know, we often do things, we behave physically with our bodies. We're not necessarily consciously thinking about what we're doing. And he's saying it's that at that level, that this kind of complicity with these relations of power or domination, that's where it's occurring. So this complicity or enactment of docility is a form of gentle or invisible violence in which subjects, according to him, misrecognize or fail to see a situation of oppression. They don't recognize it for what it is, because they've been naturalized really to accept this as normal, to accept this as the kind of everyday state of affairs. This is the way things should be. So the concept is interesting, I think, and I haven't really. I think much more work could be done with it in trying to think about what's going on with obstetric violence and oppression. But what it does is it kind of dissolves the clear boundaries between perpetrators and victims. It also dissolves boundaries between freedom and oppression, or consent and coercion. It makes things really quite mucky. You don't really have these kind of clear, separable categories. And it's also, a phenomena, this phenomena of gentle or symbolic violence, it's happening at the level of embodied actions, of kind of things that aren't necessarily said, those atmospheres, those, relational atmospheres, and kind of interpersonal dynamics. So some of the work that I've done, I've used or referred to this idea of gentle violence as a way of trying to make sense of what I've read as women's compliant performances of docility in obstetric encounters. So sorry, this really resonates a lot with your talk the other day. And I found the term of gentle violence, previous work that I've done, to be useful about how obstetric encounters often arranged in ways that encourage, in a sense, that even compel, that incite submission, basically. So I regard these kind of unsaid and normalized sets of arrangements as forces of oppression that enable outbreaks of direct violence. As such, gentle violence is completely intertwined with and productive of direct, what we would all recognize as direct violence. So in thinking about women's compliance and what I've called performances of docility, I've framed these kind of acts as ambiguous acts of ambiguous agency. They're ways of coping and calculating, not necessarily consciously, but calculating how to act in ways that are going to neutralize a kind of situation which they read as potentially having negative consequences for them. They could have a fear of being punished, of being
adaptive preferences.
Exactly, which was a new term for me. Of being met with violence, or they might just fear that care will be withdrawn, which was a major issue in the interviews that I did with women in the public healthcare sector in South Africa. There was a major fear that if they demanded too much, that care was going to be withdrawn, and it was going to leave them in a completely and really literally unsafe position. So for Lackerman and Swartz, now this use of the term gentle violence, I think, is something that triggered them in a sense. And for them, this kind of term is guilty of stretching the language of violence to the point of meaninglessness. That's the kind of angle that they're coming from. The use of the term gentle violence is marked through the title of their piece. I mean, the title is "How Gentle Must Violence Be? Violence Against Women Be in Order Not to Be Violence." So troublingly for me, what they see as the outrageousness of the term gentle violence is then used to cast doubt on the entire literature and field of obstetric violence. So I'm left wondering what went wrong here. What is going on here? If the use of the term gentle violence opens the door for this kind of backlash, then what has gone wrong? Are we in danger of becoming more subject to this kind of backlash if we don't, in a sense, ask harder questions about the work we're expecting certain concepts to do for us, and making efforts to distinguish more clearly, and also to think more, to think harder, think again about really what are the relations between oppression and violence. Sometimes we sort of take for granted that we know what these things are, but I think we need to think a bit more about that. So the concept of violence, of course, you know, Camilla and I have talked about this quite a bit. It's just impossible. It's so difficult. It's so contested. There's so many different formulations and theories of violence. And as some have noted, you know, there's so many different frameworks and types that this is increasingly becoming an elastic concept. And of course, feminist theorists have very much, in a sense, usually embraced more elastic conceptualizations of violence. For example, the idea of violence as a continuum, and also developing new lexicons, identifying new forms of violence. But there are also those feminist theorists that are in favor of more restricted definitions. So I'm thinking like the work of Sylvia Walby and Anne Cudd, who are arguing for tighter definitions around violence. And I don't know yet. You see, I just been upfront with you. I'm not quite sure what I think about it all.
Camila knows.
Camilla knows. I am wondering whether there could be some justification and some more thoughtfulness about how we differentiating different types of violence. And maybe there is something to be said for developing an adjacent vocabulary, that kind of makes sense of this other set of things going on, this other set of conditions or arrangements, in a sense that that generates and provides the conditions for the direct outbreak of violence. So what is that set of arrangements? You know, do we call that set of arrangements violence? Or do we call it something else? And that's, in a sense, what I'm thinking about at the moment. So to return briefly to this idea of the silence on the ward, which is also something that, I don't know, is really also kind of kept on, I don't know, just buzzing away in the back of my head. How do we then, because this is the thing that caused Moira Lapperman to sort of think again, that this silence on the ward that they identified in their ethnographic observations, and caused them to kind of say, but this isn't, I can't think, this is not violence. So how do we think about the silence on the ward? And how do we read or interpret silence? And of course, there can be no one meaning of silence. Silence can be resistant, it can be oppressive, it can be neutral, it can have no real essential meaning. And in terms of the silence on the ward that Lapperman is telling us that they encountered, we don't know anything about that silence apart from what they say, you know, through their ethnographic observation. We don't know what the labouring persons on the ward, how they experienced the silence, how they felt about that silence, the atmosphere, how did they make sense of it? You know, for us, that is missing knowledge. We don't know. And we can ask also, would we expect to find silence on a labour ward? Now, clearly for Lapperman, clearly this is something that is not unexpected, to find silence on a labour ward. From my perspective, I do find this unexpected and strange, but that's from my position. Also channeling some of Sara's work on the loud labouring, the loudness of the birthing body. I would expect that there's sound, that there's, you know, conversations, that there's voices, there's, you know, moaning and crying out. I would expect that on a labour ward. So what is normal in terms of, you know, how we read that silence is in the eye of the beholder, I suppose. But this kind of silence, from my point of view, seems much closer to be coterminous with a kind of oppressive and stifling atmosphere than it is, you know, than it is as a sign of contentment. How Lapperman seems to be interpreting the silence as a sign of contentment or satisfaction. It seems to me more like what Christy Dotson would kind of describe as a coerced silencing. that's really intimately connected to oppressive situations. However, I might even agree with Lapperman and Swartz at this point. I might even agree that it is a stretch to call that silence violence. I've got 3 or 4. Okay, well, I'll have to cut it. Anyway, so I might even agree with them that it's a stretch to call that silence violence. I don't know. Camilla looks at me. I said I might agree with them. Because I'm thinking to myself, would these, we don't know, you see, but would these women walk away feeling like they had experienced violence? Or would they walk away feeling like, I felt constrained, I couldn't do what I wanted to do, I wanted to like squat or move around or moan or shout, but I couldn't. So they might, maybe they feel sort of some sense of dis-ease, something wasn't quite right. But would they describe it as violence? I don't know. I think maybe they wouldn't. I don't know. But I am left wondering at this point, is the language of violence enough to make sense of the silence? Is it much? Or it's too much? You know, are we expecting it to do too much work? Exactly. And are we maybe also potentially opening doors for critiques like this one? Through, me looking at myself with this use of the term gentle violence. So in trying to kind of think about this more, I've kind of come to see what I was trying to get at, I think, with this concept of gentle violence, to think about what I saw as going on in public sector labor wards where women were sort of complying, they were sort of, in a sense, performing this kind of ambiguous agency where they were performing docility. And I tried to make sense of it through this idea of gentle violence. But more and more, I've come to think that maybe it's actually, this is rather a kind of phenomena of oppression that this is what I'm trying to get at, actually. Maybe it's better not to call it gentle violence and rather to look towards the vocabulary of what can this lexicon of oppression really offer us if we start to unpack it further and really kind of try and get to think of revitalizing this kind of concept of oppression. So I'm going to skip through some of that because how much time have I got?
I interrupted you, so maybe another 2 minutes.
Okay, wow, okay. Well, so I'm not going to get to speak much then about oppression, but just to give you some ideas about, putting these images up just to kind of signify what are some of the dominant metaphors and images that are used to talk about oppression. So we have things like the cage, the gridlock and the double bind, the net, the matrix, of course, and the kind of the ironing press as well. And these kind of images do give us a good sense in some ways about what oppression is and feels like. And it feels like being constrained, restricted, reduced, your options being made much more narrow because of the influence of invisible interlocking kind of structural forces. So I'm not going to go through that, but we do have some excellent feminist work that's been done on oppression, and those are some of the names there. I want to kind of talk probably in the last few minutes that I have about some of the work that Marilyn Frye has done. Really, she wrote a kind of iconic and famous chapter on oppression in her 1983 book, The Politics of Reality. And in her essay, she uses the image of the bird cage to develop her understanding of oppression and its mechanisms. So for her, she explains the root of the word oppress in the term press, which is very much to be squashed in between forces, to be kind of ironed, smoothed out, reduced in a sense, shaped or molded. To be caught in a double bind is another way of describing oppression. But what's interesting about the cage, and what I found really, really fascinating and interesting about Marilyn Frye's whole kind of description of the cage and why it's such a good metaphor, is because that she explains that the bird cage is only something that you can see in its holistic sense from a macroscopic kind of perspective. If you focus on just one wire of the cage, then you can't understand why the bird is immobilized, why it's trapped. You have to be able to stand back to see the cage as a whole. So if you kind of become obsessed with looking at one aspect, one wire, the cage or the oppression itself is going to be invisible. So the imagery of the cage really helps Fry to make sense of the difficulty we have in recognizing and seeing oppression for what it is. We become distracted by the details of this kind of violence or that inequality or whatever, and we miss the structure of the cage as a whole. So I'm going to skip that. The only reason why I mentioned the work of Iris Young and Anne Cudd is because both of them in their kind of frameworks or writing around oppression point to violence as being an absolutely central mechanism of oppression. So that's why I point to their work. So, for example, for Anne Cudd, violence is seen as a material force of oppression, along with other material forces of oppression, such as economic exploitation. But violence is a material force of oppression. So this gives us some way in which we can at least begin to think about how are these things related, and how do we think of that? How do oppression and violence actually work together? So the last slide, I'm going to end there. And I just want to say that while I'm committed to the lexicon of obstetric violence, I believe we could benefit from efforts to develop some more kind of explicit engagements with the relationship between oppression and violence. And of course, it's, I just also want to say I'm very much aware that, this is not new at all, because feminist writing in the 70s and 80s around childbirth were very much steeped in the language and vocabulary of oppression. So in a sense, we've kind of maybe moved away from that in a sense, but this goes back quite a long way. But the thing is with that work is that it was often rooted in a specific kind of understanding of oppression as a kind of force that uniformly disempowers. So oppression is a top-down phenomena that sort of renders all women in obstetric institutions as victims and as having no agency. That is the older kind of understanding of oppression. So I think that we need to work towards a revitalized, a new kind of thinking around what oppression is, building in, for example, the wonderful work of Patricia Hill Collins on the matrix, and thinking much more about the intersectional multiple aspects, the mobile aspects of how these, as you were saying, also obstetric violence is not just medical oppression, but we have to think about how we can think about this as multiple cages, mobile cages, and how they are actualized in particular situations. The cage doesn't look the same for everyone. It depends where you are, what geographical context, what other positionings, but nonetheless, a cage, we need to see that the cage is there. And I'll end.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we have, I'm going to have to do it from my laptop because it's I want to see, Sam, would you like to, Sam Halliday put a question in the Q&A, and I was wondering if she might like to ask the question herself. Just need to find Sam. I can unmute her. I think she might have left when I was talking. Sam, are you there? Well, I'll start with Sam's question because she put it up first, if that's all right.
Hi, sorry, my mix isn't working.
Oh, okay. So Sam says, thank you for an excellent paper, Sara. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. She's dealing with COVID again. I'm interested in the way that women are framed as risky, as they don't do as they're told, don't comply with the way society, or at least medical patriarchy, expects her to behave, the way that women's bodies are treated as a maternal environment, separate from the woman as a person, a moral agent, comes through really well in your paper. And it is seen as problematic, deficient, in need of control and improvement to fulfill its function to produce the perfect baby. How can we move away from that, particularly given your last slide, reporting on the experience of an early career obstetrician admitting OB because it was expected of her? Good luck.
$1 million question. No, thank you very much. I don't know. I mean, I'm good for asking the questions, not so much for giving the answers. But I think, this thing that I just said in the end about how also the staff is suffering from, I know a big question, yes, how the staff is suffering also for a lot of violence themselves. I think it has to be asked. I mean, I remember when I heard this young doctor, how do you say, she's just learning, how do you say that?
Trainee.
Trainee, telling me this, no, she told me, I was it made me very uncomfortable. And yet I was so pressured by the people around me, no? And then you ask again and you feel again what Rachelle was speaking now, these circles of symbolic and not so symbolic violence covering us all, no? And I think yet you need to speak about privilege and unprivilege, being more privileged. So she's less privileged than the doctors that are seeing her, but she's more privileged than I am when I'm anesthetized and she's doing to me something, right? So where is responsibility? How responsibility has to be taken? These are big questions, no? About being victims of violence and yet being somehow responsible for violence. This is, I think these are important questions. Yes.
Would you like to add anything?
No, I mean, it's a big question. I agree with that. Yeah, I mean, it pertains also to the question of oppression itself. If you're thinking of it as a cage, and how do we break out of this? And I think it links back very much to what Sara was talking about the epistemic injustice as well, and about really finding ways to kind of shift and disrupt the kind of knowledge, the knowledges that we accept around birthing, and the narratives as well, because I think more work needs to be done also in looking at what are those master narratives in society around birth, because those are the things that most people are coming into contact with when they, even growing up, before they've even thought of ever having children or whatever. These kind of narratives of what horrifying narratives of birth, or in the South African middle class context, I saw a newspaper article talking about the death of the natural birth, because people don't even hear their family members, none of them have had a vaginal birth. It's all, and so there's almost a loss of knowledge and narrative around that as well. So I think the language thing, and always to me is very important.
Nicole, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think to add that, medical practitioners themselves also find themselves as birthing people, and what that does, it complicates it. So this, almost all of the obstetricians in my study were all women, and so while that the view that used to be of this sort of this patriarchal domination with mainly male obstetricians. In the global South, that's not the case. So again, it requires that we think more deeply about the kinds of gendered relations that they are and the power relations, and that these shift and change.
Some of them avoid the medicalized labor room. That's what I know.
Yes, and they choose elective.
Yeah.
Before we go to the next question, is there a question in the room? Coming one?
I would like to say many things to Rachelle, but maybe later when I mean, if we will have some time.
I have a question.
Yes.
How can we
Could you speak up a little bit?
okay, yeah. Hello. How can we talk about different forms of violence when, and this relates a lot to what you were talking about, this kind of symbolic violence in the sense of like people being like unaware of what's happening to them, or like, talking about it in such a normalized way that they've like neutralized what's happening to them. Yeah, like how do we speak to those people about obstetric violence? Because I find that's a real challenge that I have in my day-to-day life, speaking to other mothers and hearing birth stories and just being horrified, but them just talking about it as, this happened to me and I had to have this, and having no awareness. And so it's that, like, I guess the questions around like consciousness raising and what do we do about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important, because I think I've also, been asking myself questions around that. Exactly, how do we, as conversation we were having last night, Camilla, about how do you measure then this concept, this phenomena of obstetric violence, if many of the women themselves that have had certain experiences would not identify with the term violence at all. I mean, what do we then do with that? Do we simply say this is false consciousness? And that's a sort of not a very nice way of describing things either, because then it again sort of
like to validate anybody's experience either. So it's really
and I think it's really, and I think maybe the kinds of writing that Bourdieu has done around particularly symbolic violence, where he talks about this misrecognition, which is this very issue of the fact that in a sense we do see it. It is there in front of us, the oppression or the kind of toxicity is very much in front of our faces, but somehow we can't recognize it. And I think the consciousness raising is absolutely key in terms of shifting that. And maybe things like, I don't know, I think things like the bird cage for me as an image might be a really useful way of presenting that to women themselves, and to say, do you identify, not maybe with a thing violence, but do you identify with feeling like you were in a cage of some sort during that birthing or laboring experience? And maybe we have to think out the box in that sort of way.
I want to say something about that, and it's also the things I wanted to say about also the patients. I mean, I hear Bourdieu and I say, okay, Foucault, and you say when they are speaking against this concept of violence. I mean, have you read Foucault? Don't you know this kind of concept of violence, which is of course not the typical violence which is intended, etc. And we know it's there, and then of course the concept turns to be very, very broad. But I think it's I mean, I would even dare to think or to say that everything is violence unless you see that something is not violence. I mean, I think what hasn't been a violent treatment, you will recognize it as non-violent. I mean, it's almost there. I mean, were you loved, were you cared, were you respected? Okay, so there was no violence there. All the other options, no, it's violence there. And of course, yes, it's too broad. But I mean, I see Bourdieu, I see Foucault almost in the same vein, speaking about the same. And then I also think maybe when you were saying about the oppression literally meaning and the cage, and I thought that maybe I don't know, I'm asking you also to think about it. If maybe we could say that all oppression entails violence, even if not all violence is oppression. If we think about oppression as this pressing thing, you cannot even imagine it as not using violence. I mean, to be oppressed, there must be some kind of violence involved. But the violence can also be me going in the streets and I don't know, like pushing you or I don't know, or robbing you or something like that. And maybe that won't be oppression. So maybe we could think about, this oppression being necessarily violent entail and not, even if not the opposite, and to see what do we do with this. And
I mean, I think for me, the thing that I was taking really, what I was excited about in the work of Iris Young and her 5 Faces of Oppression and the Anne Cudd book is that and Anne Cudd in particular has a whole chapter in her book, Analyzing Oppression on Violence, where she really does sort of really go into quite a lot of detail about the role that violence plays in oppression. So I I agree with you in a sense. I haven't thought these things throughout in the way that I can really know.
Can I interrupt for a second? Nicole, because I see the time is moving on and I would like to just give her a moment. Sorry, you wanted to?
Yes, sorry, I need to leave. And so I just wanted to thank you all for being here. Those of you who are listening in on Zoom, thank you so much. Those of you in the room, of course, even the little one, the little girl in between. So lovely. Yeah, I was in the room with you. I felt like I was there. Thank you for having me. And to my fellow panelists and Camilla, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your role.
Okay, pleasure. Bye-bye.
Okay. So I see we're running out of time. And there's one question in the Q&A section, and I wonder if I should read that out and then close off after that, if that's all right, everyone. So I'm a South African doctor, now PhD candidate with Queen's College doing work on epidemic justice in preconception health in South Africa. 2-part question. Obstetric violence is orientated around the pregnant and birthing person. Could it also theoretically apply to preconception health? We're talking about this. If so, if OV can occur in preconception health, can it then be perpetrated against men, as men should be included in preconception health practices?
That's a hot potato. Do you want me to tackle that?
Try, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a really, really, really interesting question that we could spend an hour sort of disentangling and answering. But I think that we need to also move towards a more kind of engagement with the idea of reproductive violence itself. So for me, this kind of preconception, the issues happening there, I don't know. I haven't thought these things through enough. I'm still thinking through them right now, I mean, at the moment. But I think I would sort of label that as fitting maybe within a reproductive violence kind of framework more. And the issue of whether men should be included, I mean, I know that this is a hot potato, divisive, volatile issue, but to be very clear about it, I think that, absolutely yes. And I regard obstetric and reproductive violence as against reproductive subjects broadly defined. So that's my position. All right.
I didn't understand so much if it was speaking about men as partners of women in the reproductive environment, or as trans men giving birth or being in reproductive processes.
Well, I think in preconception health practices as how they might be involved.
Like the partners of.
Well, I think in all the different ways that they might be able to be involved in preconception health services.
Services, not
health practices.
Yeah.
You don't have this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's a different thing how, for example, men are involved in process of reproductive injustice as staff. This is one question. I think we have already discussed this very much. As partners, it's a different question. I think it's interesting. I think you have published also, you and Nicole, how
Yes, on the masculine.
how men are involved in home births, or the decisions in birth and which place they must, which role they have, which role they must play on this. I think it's an interesting question that I haven't touched upon, and how trans men suffering also from, and of course, I think in this case, I mean, I'm thinking of like Rachelle, that they, of course, can be victims and are victims of obstetric violence and reproductive injustice, and in some ways, even in worse ways than maybe women, because they have on top of it probably an anti-trans discrimination and things like that. Yes, but I mean, those are questions that are being discussed, I think, lately.
Yeah. Okay, great. I'm going to end it there because we've used up all our time. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening. And it's great to have you here. I just really wish Nicole could be here with us in person, but we managed to get you to listen to everything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you save the chat?
Can I save the chat?
I think it will be saved.
I think so. Yeah, I'll find out. So everybody's just saying thank you. Great, incredible presentations. Sam's mic's not working. Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll share the chat. Ask some comments about silencing, but I thought I'd go to the questions first and the silencing. But yeah. And I think if there's anything that wasn't covered that you'd like to know, I can invite them to email and then share it if you want. Perfect. Thank you to CRiVA and to CELS for co-hosting. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.